Candidates, candidates, candidates. I got two more progressives for you. First one is Mike Siegel. Mike was brought up in a union family. He's a civil rights lawyer and former public school teacher who is running for the 10th congressional district in Texas, trying to unseat the Republican incumbent. He actually came pretty damn close in 2018, losing by less than 5 points in a district which theoretically has a Republican edge of 9 points. As a plaintiff side employment lawyer, he's represented women who suffered discrimination in the workplace and whistleblowers who suffered retaliation. And most recently, he served as an Austin city attorney where he represented the city in lawsuits against the state of Texas. And you can imagine how hard that task is on behalf of immigrant families, firefighters, and low-income renters. And Mike, you've had a really interesting life in terms of your work life, and I'm putting aside for a moment the life as a candidate. You've been both a public school teacher and a civil rights lawyer. So, what prompted you to leave the classroom to go into law?
Well, I was a public school teacher in Texas, in New York, and also in Oakland, California. And my last placement was in a school district in Oakland that was taken over by the state of California as part of an intervention. And they disenfranchised the local school board and closed schools. And for a couple of years, I was a part of fighting basically this effort to privatize the Oakland Public School District. And, we resisted school closures, we packed school board meetings, and engaged all sorts of political efforts. But big picture, I was being asked to teach under an administration that was completely anti-democratic and was promoting the charterization of the public schools. And I felt powerless to kind of really fight for public education in that context. And so I had this idea that becoming a lawyer would give me more leverage to affect social change. Now, whether that's actually true or not remains to be seen. My parents tried to convince me to stay in the classroom. They said being a teacher is the most useful thing you can do in this world, although they're both civil rights lawyers at this point. So it was a little do as I say, don't as I do. But but that was kind of the impetus, is like, man, all these political dynamics, it's hard to be a teacher and to fight for public education. So maybe being a lawyer will give me more strategic input.
Yes, and it's funny that you mentioned that both your parents were trying to encourage you to stay in school to be a teacher, because your father is actually a labor lawyer for farm workers, janitors, and healthcare workers, and your mom was a machinist, and then became an organizer with the International Association of Machinists. So you actually grew up in a very, very strong union household, right?
Yeah, so my mom was at a Caterpillar factory, and so there would be union barbecues at my house. My aunties were these black women who were organizing at the factory. All sorts of diverse working class folks talking politics, drinking beer. So was really raised in a household where walking on picket lines, attending hours-long meetings was the norm, and so definitely raised in a political household. I mean, in Texas, people ask me, what's your religious background, and I say, well, my dad's Jewish, my mom's Christian, but was really raised where social justice was the family mission, and being a part of unions was a big part of that.
And that's a good transition to one of the issues I want to raise with you, which you cite in your website. And you're down the line progressive, and my listeners can look at Mike's website at Siegel for Texas. That's SIEGEL for Texas .org, and I guess .com as well. You have both of those URLs, I'm sure. And you point out that as a supporter for Medicare for all, I think there's been a lot of BS that's been thrown out about Medicare for all. One of the things that you cite, and I'm going to just quote from your website, the truth is the current insurance system, private insurance, that's not your quote, I'm just explaining. The truth is it allows workers to choose health insurance if their boss likes that insurance as well. So that's based on your experience both as a union activist and your labor law experience and your legal background. You know that actually the difference between having private insurance is that the boss decides what health care you have, as opposed to Medicare for all, which basically would be a system of standards that is set by the government and that everybody enjoys.
And that everyone would actually have more choice. you wouldn't be constrained by what's in your plan. In terms of specialists or doctors or hospitals you want to go to, it would all be in your plan because it's one plan. And so, yeah, we really have to fight back against a lot of the misinformation. Unfortunately, what's happening at the presidential level with the Democratic primary is really confusing a lot of people. And so, even as I'm making calls to supporters today, people who are diehard supporters, I hear stuff about, oh, maybe Medicare for all is going too far. And the case I'm running for Congress in the Texas 10th congressional district, which is a seat that before Republicans gerrymandered Texas was held by Lyndon B. Johnson, the president who signed Medicare into law. And part of the argument we need to make is that Medicare, it was really originally drafted by Truman, I think, but it was designed to be a universal program. It wasn't going to stop at 65 and up. The idea was that after you implement the first phase, you keep adding people to the program. And so I just want to make the case here in Texas that let's fulfill LBJ's vision. Let's extend Medicare for everyone.
You're right that in the presidential primary, there's been a lot of misinformation. You put it kindly. I'd like to say bullshit put out there about what Medicare for all would mean. And there's been a lot of scare tactics to say, oh my God, you're going to have your private insurance taken away, when people don't sit back and understand, especially in unionized circumstances, that private insurance, there's all sorts of flaws to it, but it comes at a cost. And you point out again, quite correctly on your website, that what happens and has happened over the last 30 years, and I've written about this and watched it as a labor activist myself, that primarily the fights at the bargaining table have been over healthcare costs. That empties the coffers because the CEOs are pretty greedy as it is. But basically, they make the argument there's no more money because we had to basically put into healthcare costs. And if you want money for wages or benefits, and as you well know, wages have been going down and people don't have real pensions anymore, the employer says if you want money for those wages benefits, you have to give up something on your health care coverage. And so that's been essentially a terrible choice that people have made, which they won't have to make under Medicare for all.
Right. No, the wages will go up. And it may turn out that we have to pursue an approach like Ro Khanna has put forward, where we go Medicare for all state by state. And hopefully that if we do go that route, that'll give us some stories to tell. Okay, workers in these states have actually had their wages increase dramatically after we adopt a universal single payer program. The main way I've been talking about it in Texas is kind of specific to the region. I'm running for Congress in a district that includes 7 rural counties, and that has seen 3 rural hospitals close in the last 10 years, in part because the Republicans have refused Medicaid expansion. So we're in this absurd situation in Texas where our federal tax dollars are funding Medicaid expansion in 39 states, but not here in Texas. And rural hospitals are closing because they're required to provide indigent care, but they're not getting the reimbursements they would otherwise get. And so I find that for a lot of average voters off the street, it's much more useful to talk about these programs in a specific way. Under Medicare for all, your hospital stays open, and that means a lot to folks.
Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing that you mention on your website and talk a lot about is the Green New Deal. And I think we all and all my listeners believe in the concept of a Green New Deal. But one of the areas that I like to push progressives on, especially environmentalists, and I think you're going to relate to this specifically and especially because of your background as a labor person, as a union activist. One of the things you have in the Green New Deal description on your website is you talk about taking immediate action and to guarantee, and now I'm quoting, a just transition for affected workers and their families, including a jobs guarantee. One of the things that I think happens, and I'm curious what your perspective is about this, is that environmentalists, I think a lot of them, progressive people who I think mean well, want to try to do this on the cheap. And my experience in terms of job guarantees, and especially the retraining programs that we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years, is they don't really work because they train people either for jobs that don't exist or for jobs that pay a whole lot less than a good union job that someone had, especially if you've worked in the coal mine. So what's your vision of what that job would look like in terms of a guarantee?
Right on, and that's a huge issue. I mean, I'm running in a oil patch district, they call it, on the Houston side because it stretches from Austin to Houston. You do have a lot of folks who work in the fossil fuel industry. We have laborers, we have electrical workers, And when I go to the union halls, they ask me this question, what about my job? And I think we need to have a very explicit just transition that's spelled out. I mean, one of the problems, I mean, I absolutely love the Green New Deal framework, and I think it's very flexible and it can be used to confront a lot of the economic and environmental crises we're facing. But when they rolled it out initially, there wasn't a lot of emphasis on the labor piece. And to me, the idea that we have this multi-trillion-dollar jobs program where labor is not, uh, standing side by side with AOC at the outset, that is problematic, and that's a little bit of an organizing deficiency that we need to rectify. And so we need to have the just transition to be just as explicit as the rolling, the unwinding of fossil fuel energy production. And so to me, I like what Bernie has done in terms of putting out, a guaranteed 5-year transition for families. We're going to guarantee your salary until you can either take early retirement, or we can buy out your pension, or we find you a comparable position. Fossil fuel workers should not suffer for these macroeconomic decisions we're making. Here in Texas, luckily, we are showing that wind is a viable alternative. Texas is now the leader in wind energy production. Our solar energy production is doubling every year. And so we can point to those jobs as opportunities. We can also look at environmental remediation as an opportunity. We can also look at building, energy efficient housing and commercial buildings as an opportunity. And so I think we just need to put it all on the table. And also we need to, break up the Green New Deal into chunks, just like the original New Deal wasn't one legislative package, but rather it was a whole approach to legislation over a series of years. I think the Green New Deal is going to be similar. So there's already a bill about the Green New Deal for housing, for example. And I think that's a wonderful place to start, because we can go talk to the building trades unions who are going to be most affected by this transition away from fossil fuel energy and say, hey, we're actually going to create thousands upon thousands of good jobs through this Green New Deal program. And over time, we can win folks' confidence and support.
And just to dig a little deeper into this, your point is right. It has to be explicit in whatever plan there is. But I think part of the problem is the debate over what a good job is. In fact, you know what the clarion cry has been across the country, the $15 an hour minimum wage, raising it to $15 an hour as a really movement for justice. But actually, for most people, especially those people who have worked in, say, the oil patch area, coal fields, $15 an hour seems like a poverty wage compared to what they had in terms of salaries and benefits. And so I think there needs to be a little bit more education, frankly, among the progressive forces, whether it be Ocasio-Cortez or other people who don't really come from a labor union background, understand what the term is, what the term good job means to a lot of the people that you and I probably talk to.
No, we actually put on the first forum in Texas on the Green New Deal in September, and we had a representative from the electrical workers there. We had the Harris County Labor Assembly president there to talk about these issues. But even after this kind of really detailed conversation, I had a young man come up to me, and he's working in the oil fields in West Texas, and he told me he made $80,000 a year. This is a guy with a high school education. And I will say that there's no easy answer for that young man. And I had to tell it to him, look, I take your concerns very seriously. We're going to be fighting every step of the way to make sure you're not left behind. But there's obviously no guarantees that there's going to be a comparable opportunity. The problem, big picture, is that we need to let folks know that not all jobs are good jobs. And so just like we don't want to employ every American at a private prison, we don't want to employ people polluting our air and water. And so some jobs just shouldn't be on the market. And unfortunately, there are some jobs that are very well paid in oil and gas that there might not be a comparable job in a renewable industry. And so I think we have to take that one on the chin to some extent and just admit we don't have an answer to every question. But big picture, the commitment has to be to fund this program using the federal treasury, to invest in new industries, green industries, to invest in environmental remediation. Those are going to be good jobs. And to make sure all of these jobs, if you want to get a government contract that's funded by the United States government, it's going to have to be allow for collective bargaining, we support sectoral bargaining, these kinds of things. And to put all these kind of protections in place so that overall we're creating thousands upon thousands of good jobs. I think there will still be individual stories where people are suffering from this transition, but we have to mitigate that as much as possible.
Hmm. So my last question to you is: this is your second go around at this race, and you almost became the congressman of the district in the last election. You came just really shy, a little over 4% difference between you and the Republican incumbent, and less than 13,000 votes. So what do you think is different from 2018 compared to what you're looking at in 2020? Is it partly name recognition, or is the mood different? What do you sense is out there when you're going out and knocking on doors?
Well, when I started last cycle, a little over a year ago, when I first started running, actually, sorry, 2 years ago, no one thought the Texas 10th was winnable. It was gerrymandered, a 60% Republican seat. The Republican incumbent, Michael McCall, is worth over $300 million. He married into the Clear Channel fortune. So people thought of this district as a safe Republican seat. He won his race in 2016 by 19%. And so when I ran last time, it was almost like playing with house money. Nobody thought I could do much. Nobody really cared what I did. And so we just ran a really strong grassroots campaign with labor and environmental and indivisible activist support, mobilized 1,000 volunteers and narrowed the gap by 15 percentage points in one cycle. So now for 2020, this is now a national battleground district. And so there's much different expectations on the candidates, and there's much more attention. And so, for example, I've been running basically full time since February. I quit my job so I could do this full time to finish the job we started. And we've raised $400,000, which is about what I raised the entire election last cycle. And we're a year from the general election date. But from the national forces, that's not enough money, and they're backing some conservative challengers to me in the primary. And so it's we're actually to some extent a victim of our success. We've made this a very desirable seat for the Democratic Party, and so what I'm having to do is keep building on the support we've earned through all of our hard work, fighting on local issues, whether it's fighting for voting rights, fighting to close a coal plant, fighting against these horrible immigration policies. Keep earning that support, but at the same time, basically like also resisting this rearguard action from conservative Democrats who basically want to capitalize on all the gains we've made.
And is that coming directly from the DCCC, or is that from the sort of donor circles, the conservative ones?
It's indirectly through the D trip. It's directly through Emily's list. Basically, kind of these DC organizations that they don't place much value on field programs or grassroots organizing. The only things they care about are who your consultants are and how much money you have in the bank. And so they look at me and from their perch in DC, and they can't see all the work we're doing, all the support we're earning. They just look at my finance report and say, "Oh, Siegel, he can't raise millions. We're going to find somebody else." And so, I mean, to some extent, I'm just going to have to beat their candidates in the primary, and then hopefully they'll come around for the general.